Hello, my name is Wandia, and today we will be discussing the topic of carbon inequality. To better understand what carbon inequality is, we'll first be looking at what is known as the carbon budget. Then we'll discuss what the issue is with carbon inequality, how it should be informing climate change policies, and then a brief look into a case study in New York City that puts carbon inequality into context. According to the United Nations Human Development Reports from 2021, around 2,500 billion tons of CO2 have been emitted by humankind since the Industrial Revolution. The remaining carbon budget to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels is 900 billion tons of CO2. At the current emission rates, this will be entirely depleted in 18 years. To limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, the remaining budget is 300 billion tons of CO2, which will be depleted in 6 years at the current rate. In 2019, global emissions of greenhouse gases reached 50 billion tons. Even though there were sharp falls in carbon emissions in 2020, in 2021 global emissions nearly recovered to the pre-pandemic peak. So how are these emissions distributed? Of the 50 billion tons in 2019, the top 10% were responsible for about 48% of global CO2 emissions, while the 50 bottom percent were responsible for close to 12% of all emissions. The global top 1% contributed to 17% of all emissions that year. From this graph, we can deduce that the richest 1% of humans were responsible for more CO2 emissions than half of the world's population combined, and that nearly half of the 50 billion tons of CO2 emissions in 2019 were emitted by the top 10%. Carbon inequality is not only evident among class but geographically as well. As of 2021, the average individual in North America emits around 20 tons of CO2 a year. This drops to 10 tons in Europe, 2.6 tons in South and Southeast Asia, and 1.6 tons in Sub-Saharan Africa per capita. There are large inequalities in average emissions between countries, and these increase even further within each country. So now that we understand that there is a massive disproportionality in the emissions between the richest 10% and the rest of the world, naturally we'd assume that climate change policies should reflect this by differentiating between these social groups. Here are some examples of climate change policies that are informed by carbon inequality. We can see that they are tailored according to each socio-economic group. For example, a switch in energy end uses policy would be developing public transport systems for the bottom 50%, while enacting more strict regulations on polluting purchases for the top 10 and 1%. Climate policies have a history of disproportionately impacting low-income consumers over the past decades via carbon and energy taxes. Therefore, there needs to be more pressure placed on the wealthy polluters if we hope to reach the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. Moving on to a case study, this is the climate clock in New York City. Originally the metronome, it has been in Union Square for over 2 decades. On September 19th, 2020, the climate clock was unveiled as an installation for Climate Week by artists Gan Golan and Andrew Boyd. Instead of counting down to the new year, it tickles down the time the world has left if current carbon emission rates continue before it becomes impossible to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The installation went viral across social media, gaining coverage from many media outlets and sent a shockwave around the world. And many argue that it was a great way to communicate the harshness and the reality of the deadline. Others have argued that the audience for this message is largely a miss. The clock is stationed in the middle of a busy area full of pedestrian traffic. While of course everybody should aim to incorporate more sustainable practices in their daily life, the people who pass by this clock and those who view it on social media will for the most part be common individuals and not the richest 1% or even 10% that we've seen contribute to the most global carbon emissions each year. Some argue that this message also contributes to eco-anxiety, especially within marginalized communities and low-income communities. climate activist Lauren Ritchie discussed how the clock puts pressure, blame, guilt, and responsibility on the wrong individuals who have limited resources to enact meaningful change, and not the top 10%. Given what we now understand about carbon inequality, this raises the question, who could be the more appropriate audience for this message? Couldn't it be staged where the richest 1% flock? We can appreciate the motivation behind this installation, seeing that the clock reached a large enough audience, and that people, even if powerless as individuals, have the ability to band together and make genuine change. These are my works cited, and thank you for listening.